Thank you all for coming on a stormy night, but we're glad to have you here at the Ford Presidential Library. As for most of you know, I'm Elaine DDA, and it's my privilege to be the director of the library here in Ann Arbor and the museum in Grand Rapids. Tonight we're glad you're with us, and you're biding the time while the election returns come in. Let me assure you, you won't miss anything by being at this program because you're going to have a fabulous night with us, and besides which there won't be definitive information until much later tonight anyway. As usual, it's a privilege to tell you that this program is brought to you by the National Archives and Records Administration, which is our parent organization, with additional support from the Ford Presidential Foundation. So tonight I'm going to make a very brief introduction of our speaker because he has so many stories to share. I wouldn't want to steal any of his time. We hosted Tom Tudor last November at the Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, and his talk was so well received that we invited him to come back to share with you this evening. Tom has been a speaker about Arlington National Cemetery and its history for the last 25 years. He speaks to hundreds of organizations around the country and is an authority on Arlington and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. He served as a U.S. Army Sentinel at Arlington and then Relief Commander and was on duty there from '69 to 1970. He is the president of the Society of the Honor Guard, as you can see, and a member of the board. So without further details about his background, let me turn the podium over to him. Welcome Tom Tudor to the Ford Library.
Thank you, Elaine. Big thank you to the Ford Library, to Elaine for hosting me here, and to Kate Murray for doing a lot of the legwork to make this all possible so I could come here and share some stories with you that I believe will resonate with you as Americans. And I'm going to ask our veterans to stand, if able, for just a moment. Please stand, veterans. Thank you all. And I know some people sort of bristle at the thank you for your service, but I think it's sincere when it comes from the heart. When I say it, I mean it. Thank you all for your service, for what you did for our great nation, for making this and for helping make and keep this the freest nation on the planet. I was given a huge, huge gift as a 20-year-old soldier in the United States Army when I volunteered for and was accepted to serve as Sentinel and then Commander of the Relief at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier from February 15th of 1969 until May the 30th of 1970. Now, May the 30th in 1970 was the last year that Memorial Day was by law on the 30th of May. Now, the first ever 30th of May celebration was celebrated in Arlington National Cemetery by order of General John Logan, who was then Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic. Well, the Grand Army of the Republic was the large and the largest veterans organization on the Union side in the wake of the Civil War, and it actually reached a membership of nearly 500,000 in the 1890s, 25 years after the end of the war. And there were still, of course, many veterans around, and the Grand Army of the Republic celebrated on May 30th of 1868, the first ever Decoration Day in Arlington. Now, how many of you are old enough to remember your parents and grandparents calling it Decoration Day? And General Logan I read a memoir by his wife because he never wrote anything for himself, but she describes going to Richmond right after the end of the Civil War and going to the Hollywood Cemetery. And if you haven't been there, it's a very interesting place. It is the final resting place of over 20,000 Confederate soldiers and the final resting place of 2.5 presidents. Now, when I say that, what do I mean? I mean John Tyler. I mean James Madison. And the half is Jefferson Davis. It is a very interesting place. The only other 2 cemeteries that have 2 presidents, 2 real presidents, are the United First Parish Church in Quincy, Massachusetts, which has both John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and then Arlington. And a lot of people don't know who the other president buried at Arlington is, because we all remember the Kennedy funeral. Most of us in this room. Some do not. But William Howard Taft is the other president buried at Arlington, the only president to have, after being president, served on the U.S. Supreme Court, and he served as Chief Justice. And he's one of 4 Chief Justices buried in Arlington. There are 8 Associate Justices buried in Arlington as well. But Taft is the only one, the only president who went on to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. So Arlington is the final resting place of over 400,000 American servicemen and their next of kin. It is the only national cemetery that has veterans from every war that the United States has fought in, from the Revolutionary War forward to the present day. And I have what I call part 2, and we're not going to get to part 2 tonight, because it's going to take us a long time to get through part 1. But part 2 is called Who's Buried in Arlington? And maybe there will be another opportunity for that somewhere down the road. But it is an amazing, amazing, amazing list of personalities from American history and American popular culture who are buried in Arlington National Cemetery that amazes me every time I walk in the place. I was just there. I was just there for the reunion of the Society of the Honor Guard Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And we had about 150 of us, former Sentinels, there telling stories and exchanging bits of information about our service there and things that we remember well from the days we spent walking in the heat and the rain and the sleet and the cold and the snow and doing what we did. We had a special guest at our reunion. His name was Ron Rosser. And Ron Rosser was a Medal of Honor recipient from the Korean War. And he's the only surviving of the casket bearers from the double interment in 1958. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit, when both a Korean unknown and a World War II unknown were laid to rest on the same day, Memorial Day, May 30th of 1958. And the reason I like that May 30th day is it can fall any day of the week. And it doesn't have to be a Monday, and it doesn't have to be a reason to go to the cabin on the lake, or to have a barbecue, or whatever. It's a day that was set aside for us to honor those who have paid the ultimate price, who have given their last full measure of devotion for this nation. That's why we call it Memorial Day now. It was Decoration Day and officially Memorial Day from 1888 forward. But we remember it now, and I remember it as Memorial Day, and to me, it's not just the last Monday of the month. It's May 30th to me still. And that was my last day on duty in 1970. We got off at 7 o'clock that morning. And I tell you what, if you've ever been around Arlington when the president comes, it's an experience. But the president was going to come that day, and we were getting off duty that morning. And that was my last day of duty before I got out of the U.S. Army. And I was one of the few fortunate ones who volunteered and got to serve in that capacity. I got to be one of these guys. And actually, that is I. Now, my 8th grade English teacher is having a moment of pride when I said, that is I. I was in this photograph, we call it the Battalion Photographer because it was my 4th month anniversary of the first ever time I walked on the mat at the tomb. Now the mat is this black thing you see here, and it is there for 3 reasons. It is hard rubber, it's about 1/4 inch thick, and it has ribs all running the length of it, okay? And it serves several reasons, several purposes. The first purpose is a little bit of insulation, because these slabs of granite here are about 18 inches deep. So when those slabs of granite get good and cold, that cold can transfer right up into your feet and your legs. So it gave us a little bit of insulation. Also, it gave us a little bit of traction, because Tomb Guard shoes are standard issue Army leather dress shoes. They are spit shine, but they have 3 soles and 3 heels. And on the inside of those 3 heels are steel plates, so that when you bring your heels together, you make a nice loud crack. And we have horseshoe plates on the bottoms of those heels. So instead of wearing out heels, we wore out horseshoe plates, and we sent our shoes, when that horseshoe plate got down to the thin place at the back where you sent it to the post cobbler. We had a post cobbler, and he knew what to do with that. He slapped another set of horseshoe plates on and sent them back. But the main reason that mat is there is to prevent our shoes from wearing a groove in the granite, because this is walked on 24/7, okay? And it has been for a long time. And I'll tell you about why we started guarding the tomb and when we started guarding the tomb 24/7 in just a little bit. But I was walking the mat that day, and right next to here is a crack. And the tomb has been cracking for many, many years. It came out of a quarry in Colorado. I'm from Colorado Springs. I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I've been into the quarry where the tomb came from. And not only did that quarry near Marble, Colorado, produce the marble for the crypt covers here and the tomb itself, it also produced the exterior of the Lincoln Memorial, my favorite memorial in Washington, D.C. The Lincoln Memorial, that beautiful white marble, came from Colorado in the 19-teens. It was carved out and with these cable saws and transported and pulled out of there with block and tackle and timbers. I mean, no cranes, no hydraulics, and all brought to Washington. It was all finished up there and brought in pieces and assembled like a big jigsaw puzzle, and all the pieces fit. Pretty remarkable. This little town that now has 70 people had 1,500 people in 1914 when they were cutting these things and putting them all together for the Lincoln Memorial. But the quarry also produced this, and this is a crypt cover for the World War II unknown, and it simply says 1941 to 1945. And the person in here, the unknown soldier in here, represents the 78,750 Americans who did not come back from the Second World War. They just disappeared. No bones, no dog tags, no nothing. Nothing to send home to bury. Just the big question mark of what happened. And this is the crypt cover for the Korean unknown. It simply says 1950 to 1953. And that is the representative of the nearly 8,000 who went missing in Korea. So, and this, the World War I unknown, lies beneath here. And we are coming up in 2021 on the centennial of the interment of the World War I unknown. And that's going to be a big deal for my society, because we are going to have some some amazing things going on the 100th year anniversary. And just like Sunday is going to be the 100th year anniversary of the signing of the armistice. And I'm going to be in, that day I'm going to be at the Herbert Hoover Library in West Branch, Iowa. And we're going to talk about that 100th anniversary and how all that played out. But this says, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." And there is no way that anyone ever, living or dead, could have known the identity of the person in this grave based on the way that the selection was done. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But it was the first day, that 4th month anniversary, the first day that I got to wear this badge on my right breast pocket. If anybody wants to see the real deal here, I'll have it in my pocket when we come down. When I come down afterwards, I'll have it to show you in my pocket. You can touch it if you'd like. This is the second least awarded badge in the United States military. The least awarded badge is the astronaut's badge, and that's in the high 200s. You have to have flown to space, gone to the ISS, either on a Russian or the shuttle. But you have to have flown into space as an American astronaut to get that badge. This is number 78 in a series of 662. We just awarded number 662. The Army has very recently, so I will have this in my pocket afterwards, and I will gladly show it to you. So, in the Society of the Honor Guard, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, we have a motto, just like the Boy Scouts have a motto. And all you old Scouts know, be prepared. Our motto is, soldiers never die until they are forgotten. Tomb guards never forget. We also have something we call the Sentinels Creed, and it goes like this. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, never will I falter. And with dignity and perseverance, my standard will remain perfection. Through the years of diligence and praise and the discomfort of the elements, I will walk my tour in humble reverence to the best of my ability. It is he who commands the respect I protect, his bravery that made us so proud. Surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night, this soldier will in honored glory rest under my eternal vigilance. Oops, sorry. So, this creed, and I will repeat it later, this creed was not written by a tomb guard. It was handed to a tomb guard by a member of the public who had written it himself, and his name is Simon, and we know nothing about him and where he is or why he wrote it. But immediately it was embraced by the tomb guards, and that was in 1971. And Simon's poem is still held close and dear in all of our hearts and all of our minds. So, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Sentinels and what it was like and some of the things that I experienced while guarding this shrine and some of the feelings and emotions that I had while guarding these 3 individuals who lost not only their lives but their identities. It was a pretty powerful and moving experience to spend a night, or part of a night, by yourself. Here I was, a 20-year-old kid from Iowa, standing guard at one of our nation's great shrines, and the moon now is overhead. And I'm here with 3 individuals that I could only imagine who they were and what they did or how they died. But there was a bond there that is hard to describe, that is difficult to put into words. But before I talk about the tomb guards, I'm going to talk a little bit of Arlington history. The first person to own the property where Arlington is located was a ship's captain named Robert Howson, who was given 6,000 acres of land in exchange for transporting settlers aboard his ship from England to Virginia. Now, Howson got basically a 2-mile strip from the southern end of Roslyn all the way down, including all this. There, if you're familiar, that's the Kennedy gravesite right there. And that is the Arlington House right now. Under construction, inside and out. You can't get close to it. You can't get in it right now. All of the historical exhibits now that were in the Arlington House are now down in the exhibit space that also is shared by the Women in Service to America exhibit. Straight in Arlington Drive as you come into the cemetery, there's this wonderful exhibit about the women in service to our great country. But this 6,000 acres of land that he was given today would be worth tens of billions of dollars, or possibly more. Some of the most valuable real estate in the United States on the west bank of the Potomac River across from the nation's capital. They are building higher and more and denser in Roslyn and Arlington every year. But I just came back from there, and I can tell you that the construction is nonstop on that side of the river. But he sold that property for 6 hogsheads of tobacco. Large barrel of tobacco. Well, that was pretty valuable in those days, but you know what? Not worth tens of billions of dollars in today's currency. So he sold it for 6 barrels of tobacco, and very shortly after being granted that property by then Governor of Virginia, William Barclay, and it went into the hands of the Alexander family, and the Alexanders created Alexandria, Virginia, and then the next person to purchase it was a guy with a famous mother, and his name is John Parke Custis. And that is his mother, Martha Dandridge Custis, just newly married to this guy, George Washington. Now, they were married on January 6th of 1859. She had lost her husband, had died in 1757. They were married in 1759. And just about a month and a few days before his 27th birthday. Washington never had any natural children, but these became his children. John Parke, they called him Jackie, and Martha Parke Custis, they called her Patsy. And in 1778, John Parke Custis, when he was in his early 20s, bought 1,100 of those 6,000 acres that Howson had originally been given. And those 1,100 acres are now what consists of Arlington National Cemetery and Fort Myer, Virginia, which is the fort where I was stationed and where the Old Guard, or the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, is stationed. It was right behind. And Arlington, if you can imagine, is sort of a large oval, and Fort Myer sort of embraces it with a crescent, like a crescent moon from behind. So this property was purchased by John Parke Custis, but he died. He died 3 years later in 1781, and he was an aide to this gentleman, his adoptive father. He was a civilian. He was not a military aide. He was a civilian aide de camp to his adoptive father, George Washington, at Yorktown. And after Cornwallis had surrendered, he got sick and died of camp fever. And that could be any number of ailments that don't kill you anymore, like diphtheria and typhus. But he passed the property to his 6-month-old son, George Washington Parke Custis, named in honor of his adoptive grandfather. And as soon as the father died, then Washington adopts the grandson and it becomes his son. So George Washington Parke Custis is legally also George Washington's son. And George Washington Parke Custis is the person who builds the Arlington House and this slave-holding plantation within sight of the nation's capital in the early 1800s. Now, Arlington's this is the house, and so I'm going to go to the next slide because I have a little story to tell. This is what the District of Columbia looked like when it was first drawn in 1795. It was 10 miles on a side, or 10 miles square, not 10 square miles, 100 square miles, 10 by 10. And it was like a square tipped at an angle of 45 degrees, and a large chunk of it was in Virginia. Everybody thinks, oh, Maryland gave up this part. Well, this is the current District of Columbia, but it extended into Virginia, and Arlington is about right here. And the slave traders in Alexandria and this part of Virginia had heard that slave trade was probably going to be banned or outlawed in the District of Columbia before too long. And in 1846, they got their piece of the District of Columbia back. And it was called the Retrocession of 1846, when legislation gave the Virginia part of the District of Columbia back to Virginia, and so they could continue their slave trade unabated. So, and that continued, although the Compromise of 1850 totally outlawed slave trade in the district. So the district was free of slave trade from that point, from 1850 on. So this is Old Town Alexandria, and if you ever go down to Alexandria, you can actually go and see the slave pens, the pens where they herded slaves like cattle before they went on the auction block. Pretty sobering place to visit, where human beings were sold like cattle. So now, I'm going to go back to here. This house was built by George Washington Parke Custis, and George Washington Parke Custis had 4 children. And like many families in those days, a lot of the kids died. Childhood diseases killed a large percentage of the children who were born. And he had only one child who lived to be an adult, and her name was Mary Anna Randolph Custis. And on the 30th of June of 1831, in the room right behind these columns, she married her 3rd cousin and childhood playmate. Many of you may not recognize him, but we'll try this. Robert E. Lee. Now, may I remind you, there's been a lot of clamor about statues coming down and memories, people trying to erase memories, but Robert E. Lee served faithfully in the United States Army for 32 years. From his graduation in West Point in 1829 until the beginning of the Civil War, or the War of Rebellion, or as I called it when I spoke in New Orleans, the National World War II Museum, the War of Northern Aggression, which is what they call it down there. But that's a slanted view of the War of Rebellion, which is another way to look at it. But and he remained faithful. He actually led the party that arrested John Brown at Harper's Ferry. It was his action that arrested John Brown, and of course, John Brown was eventually executed for the raid at Harper's Ferry, where he and some slaves tried to capture weapons and begin a rebellion. It didn't happen, of course. We know that. But he had just come back from Texas. He had been assigned in Texas, and Texas was in the process of seceding, and the government ordered him back. So he was living at the Arlington House because he and his wife lived there with her parents until their deaths, 1853 and 1857. And then things broke about him. Fort Sumter was fired on the 12th of April of 1861, and 6 days later, Lee is summoned to the District of Columbia by Francis Blair Sr., whose son Montgomery Blair is in Lincoln's cabinet. He's a family friend, and they figured if a friend offered him command of Union armies, he couldn't refuse. So Lee is offered command of Union armies when the Civil War has just broken out. And he declines. And he goes back to that house, and he writes an eloquent letter of resignation from the United States Army that he had served so faithfully and so well for 32 years to his mentor, General Winfield Scott. And he said at the end of the letter, but some of the content was, "I have treasured my friendship with you and all the friendships that I have developed through my service, and I shall not raise my sword save in defense of my native Virginia." So he was a Virginian more than he was an American. And his roots went back to 1639, to Richard Lee, the founder. Two signers of the Declaration of Independence in his line, Francis Lightfoot Lee and Richard Henry Lee. And his father was Henry Lee III, also known as Light Horse Harry Lee, three-time governor of Virginia and Revolutionary War hero. So he was Virginia through and through, and he could not raise his sword save in defense of his native Virginia. So he went off a few days later to Richmond and offered his services to the governor of Virginia and urged his wife to follow as quickly as possible. She followed a couple of weeks later, packing up the valuables and leaving many valuable things in the house. But in May, after the voters of Virginia voted to secede, federal troops come across and take control of the property. And this house, this Arlington House, becomes the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac and remains so throughout the Civil War. So the house is seized, physically seized by Union troops, and Irvin McDowell, right here, gathers 32,000 troops in Arlington Heights, and he marches them off in July to a place called Manassas Junction, where the first major land battle of the Civil War is fought. Of course, we know it as Bull Run because the Northerners called it by the name of the stream or the body of water that was close by, and the Southerners by the name of the city or village that was closest. So that's why Antietam is Antietam Creek and Sharp, so Sharpsburg. But so he led 32,000 troops off, and the artifacts that George Washington Parke Custis had accumulated were being pilfered by Union troops. And so he ordered them crated up and sent to the U.S. Patent Office for storage until the end of the war. And many of them were never repatriated to the Lee family, of course, because we know that what happened at the end of the war. So May 23rd and 24th, these guys come across and take control of the property. Now, Mrs. Lee, in 1863, is ordered to show up in person to pay $92.07 in taxes at a federal office in Alexandria because a law had been passed in 1862 called a tax on insurrectionary districts. So she was ordered to come and show up in person. She was not stupid. What would have happened had she shown up in person? She had a high probability of being taken prisoner. And so she sent a male cousin, I believe his name was Frederick Findell, with the money, and the money was refused. That refusal is the crux of a court case because their son in 1877 takes the government to court. And in 1882, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds a lower federal court ruling, that Mrs. Lee was denied due process, that she had made a good faith effort to pay that tax by paying via a third party, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a lower court ruling in 1882 and then turned around and gave title to the property back to their son, George Washington Custis Lee. Okay, so that occurred in 1882, and he was not interested in occupying the property. His mother was. She wanted all those 15,000 corpses dug up and taken away. She petitioned Congress repeatedly, but they just called her the traitor's wife. And she got nowhere, but the son did it right, and he got it legally. He got title legally through the court system, and in 1883 turned around and sold it back to the federal government for $150,000 fair market value. So Arlington became government property again. Now, it had been already seized and auctioned off once, but now it was government property again. But in the spring of 1864, this guy, Montgomery Cunningham Meigs, was Quartermaster General of the U.S. Army from May 15th, 1861. He took the place of Joseph E. Johnston. Does that name ring a bell to you Civil War buffs? He was one of the more capable Confederate generals because he had gone to the other side. So Joseph E. Johnston went to fight for the Confederate States of America, and this guy became Quartermaster General of the Army. Well, he was an engineer by trade, and when it was deemed that this was not suitable for this beautiful new Capitol, when they added the wings here, the new House chamber on the south side and the new Senate chamber on the north side, which are not built yet, that this looked silly. So he was charged with constructing the new Capitol Dome. And here it is under construction, and that is the cast iron dome that is going to be jacked up into place. And that is underneath all that stuff. And that dome isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon. It weighs a lot. But they got it up into place. And all this crowd here, these guys are waiting to see the inauguration, the first inauguration of Abraham Lincoln on the 4th of March of 1861. But this is what the dome looked like on that date. It was finished by the end of 1863 and looks very much like it does today. But that was Meg's project, and if you ever get a back scene tour of the Capitol, you see Meg's cut his name all over the place. Meg's was quite full of himself. On his grave in Arlington, it says, scientist, patriot, all these soldier, all these wonderful, wonderful things that described him. But, and one of the things was egomaniac, but he didn't have to put that on there. So Meg's was very full of himself, but this was his project. But he was credited. Here we go. Meg's. This is there were 5 of these gates in Arlington. This is the only one that remains. When the cemetery opened, it was 200 acres, and they had 5 gates. And this is the Mcclellan Gate. God knows why we should name it after somebody who hated to fight and loved to drill. But there were Mcclellan Gate. There were gates, 4 other gates that have been destroyed, but this is the only one that still remains. And of course, this is one of the caissons of the old guard taking a serviceman to his final resting place. So it was at Meg's inspiration that we should turn this former plantation into a Union graveyard. And so on the 13th of May of 1864, the first military burial occurred. Private William Henry Christman of Pennsylvania. Now, he was not shot. He got measles. He developed peritonitis, and he died in the district, and they brought him across on May the 13th and buried him in Section 27, one of my favorite sections in Arlington. If you're familiar with the layout of Arlington and where the Marine Memorial is, or as some lady asked a friend of mine after a guard change, can you tell me where I can find the IWO Jima Memorial? Yes, it's right within a stone's throw of the Marine Memorial on the north end of the cemetery. And this is where all the early enlisted people were buried. Private William Henry Christman on a hillside, and right next to him, William B. Blatt. And Blatt is right next to Christman, and he was the first combat casualty buried in Arlington on the 14th of May of 1864. And they continued burying the dead there. But just to the right of Blatt is a U.S. colored troop. And this was before Arlington was official. Arlington did not become official until the 15th of June. It became a national cemetery, and it was policy that blacks and whites were not buried together in official cemeteries. But the early burials, the U.S. colored troops are mixed in with the early enlisted deaths in Arlington. And of course, this was taken in the fall. Of course, that's my favorite time at Arlington. I just got back from there, and it looks like this right now. And of course, they're going to get this cold front come through, and many of those leaves are going to go away. But it is my favorite time. And Arlington looked like this. You were buried in Arlington at the outset because A, you were unknown, or B, your family could not afford to have you embalmed and sent home in a proper casket. And I just read a book, fascinating book, by Drew Gilpin Faust. It's called This Republic of Suffering. And it's very sad because it's about death in the Civil War, but it is very revealing as well as how the Civil War burst around us, and neither side, the Confederate nor the Union side, was prepared to deal with the volume of death and bodies and burials that they had to deal with. And this Arlington was one of those attempts to deal with that. Now, these are not stones. This is an 1865 photograph of Arlington, and these are wooden planks. And they're whitewashed, and they're stenciled. And they had a 5-year cycle of repainting them. Well, you know what? That wasn't enough. That wasn't frequently enough. And so in 1873, Congress authorized the use of marble. And marble has became and has been the standard in national cemeteries ever since 1873. So this is right to the right of Blatt. This is J.H. Smith, a U.S. colored troop, and I was just up in that section and marveling at how many of the colored troops are intermingled in that section with Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and then U.S. colored troops. And of course, this Union shield was cut into all these Civil War graves, emblematic of protecting the Union, the shield, and that shield was used all the way up until the Spanish-American War. And then after the turn of the century, they disappeared from American military graves. Now, Montgomery Cunningham Meigs wanted to make darn sure that the Lees would never wish to return to the property. So he did something a little strange. He dug a pit in Mrs. Lee's rose garden, 10 feet deep and 20 feet in diameter. And in that pit, he buried the skeletal remains of 2,111 unknown soldiers gathered after the war from the fields of Bull Run and the route to the Rappahannock. Their remains could not be identified, but their names and deaths are recorded in the archives of their country, and its grateful citizens honor them as their noble army of martyrs. May they rest in peace. September 1866. Now, if I have a young person in the front row, I ask them to come up and touch my hand. And I tell that young person, you now have a living flesh and blood connection with the year 1866. And they look at me like I have lobsters crawling out of my ears. And I ask them, am I alive? You just touched my hand. Yes, they say, you seem to be alive. I said, the hand that you just touched held the hand of a man born that year, and I called him Grandpa. And they look at me and they say, what? And my point here for them and for you is the Civil War is not ancient history. And we see reminders of that. And in my family, 3 generations from that date to me standing here speaking to you in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library, and I'm privileged and honored to be here. But that is the lesson I take from many of these things, is that we are not that far distant from this national trauma that we call the Civil War. Now, this was built for that Decoration Day, that first Decoration Day in 1868. And that first speaker at this dais was a young James Garfield, 13 years before he became president. Of course, he was shot not long after becoming president of the United States. But he was an orator of note, and he spoke at the first ever Decoration Day. Now, of course, we fast forward. 1914, of course, the Great War begins, and the world is embroiled, except for the United States. Immediately, the nations of Europe are at it within weeks of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip. And then we come in 1917. But before that, in 1915, following the Second Battle of Ypres, in Flanders, in western Belgium, the town of capital Y, P-R-E-S. There were 5 battles for that town, And after the second battle, and the second battle was the first battle in which Germans used poison gas. They used both chlorine and mustard gas at Ypres in April of 1915. And the 17-day battle with no more than 60 seconds of silence, of machine guns not firing, artillery not firing for 17 days. The town was reduced to rubble, but the people who stayed there lived in their cellars. But it was fought over 5 times. And after the battle, a gentleman named John McCrae, a lieutenant colonel, he was a published poet, he was a doctor, he was a soldier. And he sat on the end of a wagon after a friend of his funeral. And he sat down and wrote, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow." That's a misprint. "Between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing flies, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up a quarrel with the foe. To you from falling hands we throw the torch. From failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." And he threw the poem away. And a friend of his rescued it and sent it to London. And in December of 1915, it was published in the magazine Punch. And it went, quote, viral, if anything could go viral, in 1915. And in 1919, the poppy lady, Madame Guérin, came to the United States, and she decided that she had sold the idea to the French people that the poppy should become the symbol of Remembrance Day. Of course, if you know Brits and Canadians, they've called it Remembrance Day since the beginning. In 1920, the American Legion picked it up and decided that the poppy should be the flower, and then the following year, 1921, they decided that the daisy should be the flower. In 1922, the VFW picked it up, and by 1923, they began the production of the Buddy Poppy. And it was called the Buddy Poppy because the guys who were assembling these, the disabled veterans who were assembling these for the proceeds to go to the widows and orphans of those who had been killed in the Great War, they were doing it for their buddies. So the Buddy Poppy was born in 1923 when I was a kid in Des Moines. These were sold on the street corner around this time of year everywhere. You couldn't walk down the street without being accosted by some VFW guy trying to sell you a flower. But in 1920, on the second anniversary of the signing of the armistice, the British and the French interred unknowns. The British did theirs in Westminster, and it's called the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. And the French did theirs beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris and called it Le Tombeau de le Poilu Inconnu. And they put an eternal flame on it. Well, that eternal flame was Jacqueline Kennedy's inspiration for the eternal flame that ended up at JFK's grave. And I've read an account of the quartermaster who learned 18 hours before the funeral that Mrs. Kennedy wanted an eternal flame. And he made it happen. He bought a luau torch, and he went to the metal shop at Fort Myer and got this collar created and got a contractor to dig a ditch to a propane tank behind some bushes. And one of the old guard soldiers over there sat there and turned that tank on, and they timed how long it took the gas to get over there. And they had to wet down all the branches and the greenery because the Secret Service was afraid the whole thing was going to blow up in Mrs. Kennedy's face. And so it happened, and it worked. But the British lost nearly 900,000 in that war. We lost 116,000, and the French lost 1.4 million. So it was decided, legislation introduced by Representative Hamilton Fish of New York, and he was a war hero. He had commanded the Harlem's Hellfighters, that brigade, I believe it was a battalion of black soldiers from New York, who fought in the First World War. But he introduced legislation as he was a member of the House of Representatives in December of 1920. And the last piece of legislation that Woodrow Wilson signed on March 4th, the morning of Warren G. Harding's inauguration, authorized that legislation that authorized a tomb for the unknowns for the United States. And here we have a photograph from October of 1921, October 24th. And this is our unknown, having been selected here in the Hôtel de Ville, or Town Hall of Chalon-sur-Marne, France. And they brought 4 sets of unknown remains of Americans from 4 American cemeteries and put them 4 identical caskets in this place. And Sergeant Edward F. Younger was given a spray of white roses, and he laid that spray of white roses on one of those caskets, and that casket became this one. And this is the one that will come out and will come to the United States. And there were 3 places that were under consideration. Now, Rodman Wanamaker wanted to put him in Central Park because he'd be a great tourist attraction. Now, there was a crypt that was built beneath the rotunda of the Capitol to accommodate the body of George Washington. And that was never used because Washington chose to be buried at Mount Vernon. And that was one of the considerations. But Arlington won out as the place where this soldier would come to rest for eternity. And of course, as you see all the honor guards here, with great ceremony, he was brought out, taken to the train, and there are the roses used to select him. And that is John J. Pershing accompanying. And here, the roses still on the casket and being taken across the gangway to the USS Olympia, which is still afloat in Philadelphia. The Naval Shipyard, I've heard they are restoring the hull, and that is it was in danger of sinking, but the Olympia is still there and being restored as we speak today. So taking across to the Olympia, and he rode in the bow of the ship with the French tricolor and an American flag on the cable railing. And they had to lash him down at the middle of the Atlantic because he was in danger of flying off the ship, because of course the North Atlantic can get pretty choppy in the wintertime. In November, so they arrived at the Naval Gun Factory in Washington, and of course brought him to the Capitol building, where he lay in state on the Lincoln catafalque, the same catafalque that Lincoln lay in state on in 1865. That is William Howard Taft and Warren G. Harding paying their respects in the Capitol Rotunda. And then coming out and down to the caissons. These caissons are still in use by the Old Guard today. There are 3 of them. And they are of this vintage. They are the same caissons that were used in 1921. And so there's Pershing. He will walk with the casket, and they will go up Pennsylvania Avenue and all the way up M Street. If you know your D.C. geography, you think, why didn't they just go across the Memorial Bridge? It hadn't been built yet. Well, they got up into Georgetown. Well, why didn't they go across the Key Bridge? Well, the Key Bridge was under construction. So they went across the old Aqueduct Bridge. And President Harding got stuck in a 3-hour traffic jam trying to get to Arlington. And he was furious. And one of the reasons that the Memorial Bridge eventually got built was because Harding was angry at being caught in a traffic jam, and he said there's got to be a better way from here to there. And of course, the Memorial Bridge was built and completed in 1932, and symbolically and in reality connected the Union of Lincoln with the South of Robert E. Lee. Now, in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, Andrew Johnson extended an amnesty to all who had fought on the Confederate side, except for Robert E. Lee. And Lee had to apply. And so Lee was made on the same day that he became president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, now called Washington and Lee. On the same day, October 2nd of 1865, he signed his amnesty oath and had to send it to to grant for approval, and it got lost. And somehow William Seward got a hold of it and gave it to a friend of his as a gift. And so Lee's request for amnesty and reinstatement of citizenship was misplaced. It was found in the National Archives in 1970. And Representative Harry Byrd, Jr. of Virginia, from 1970 to 1975, finally got the House to agree to vote on legislation, and they voted 407 to 10 in favor of reinstating Lee's citizenship. And that was July 22nd, 1975. And 2 days later, then President Gerald Ford went across the river and signed the reinstatement of citizenship legislation in the Arlington House. So Lee was restored by President Gerald Ford on that date in 1975. Now I stuck this in here because this date is coming up. And this, of course, that is Ferdinand Foch, and these are all the individuals who signed that agreement somewhere between 5:12 a.m. and 5:20 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month to effect the 11th hour, but it was signed way before the 11th hour. And there were a lot of things that went on between that 5 a.m., 5:12 or 5:20 signing until it finally went into effect. There were soldiers that died right up to the very end. There was an American who died just moments before. His name Gunther. But that was pretty amazing. There were no Americans present at that signing. Only representatives of the British, German, and British, German, and French governments. Matthias Erzenberger was the German civilian in command, was given authorization to sign. But that rail car was also the site where Hitler required that the capitulation be signed by the French in 1940. That rail car was towed into Germany, and when the Allies were approaching it, they torched it. Some civilians saved parts of it, but the memorial now has a sister car that was in the same line, but exact same car, but not the exact car that was used for the signing. And that car was Foch's Mobile Command Center. So, Warren G. Harding presiding over the interment of the remains, and there is Pershing dropping a fistful of soil into the grave, and this is what the tomb looked like. In 1925, a soldier came by from the Great War and found a family having a picnic lunch on top. He immediately went to the White House and told then President Calvin Coolidge what was going on. And Coolidge said, we need to do something, and Coolidge put a civilian guard on the next day. March 25th, 1926, the U.S. Army took over, and the U.S. Army has always guarded the tomb of the unknown soldier. I tell people I was a tomb guard, and they say, oh, you were a Marine. I said, no, I was U.S. Army. I have all the greatest respect and admiration for the United States Marine Corps, but they have never guarded the tomb of the unknown soldier. And that has always been an Army job because A, the Army is the senior service, and B, the Department of the Army administers Arlington National Cemetery. So then, in 1931, this replaced this, okay? You can tell, look at that gap there. No gap there. That's one piece. So this is a total replacement here. And these are three figures, peace with the dove, valor with the sword, and victory in the center, embracing them both. And this is cracking. I told you about the crack. I know a gentleman who lives in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He's a Rotarian, and he has paid $31,000 for the replacement block. And that block is sitting in the mill yard at Marble. And legislation in 2009 killed the project. Legislation sponsored by Senators Webb and Akaka stopped it cold. We don't know who was calling in favors that day, but nothing has happened. So my friend John Haynes would like to see his block used. He's 74 now, and hopefully he'd like to see it used before he leaves the planet. But these are wreaths of mourning. They are open at the bottom. It's like a horseshoe that holds the luck. This is a wreath of sadness or mourning. The sadness seeps out. This is a wreath of victory. If you're a coin collector, you know wreaths are always open at the top on coins. They're closed. They're closed at the bottom with a tie or the lace. But this is a wreath of sadness or mourning. There are 6 of them, 3 on each side, depicting the 6 major battles that the U.S. fought in the First World War. So, midnight, July 2nd, 1937, after it was discovered that people were coming in at night when the tomb was not guarded, were coming into the cemetery at night with hammers and chisels and knocking pieces off to take home as souvenirs. Midnight, July 2nd, 1937, a 24-hour guard was posted, and the tomb has been guarded nonstop ever since. And I had the privilege of 15 and a half months of guarding that place that we call the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And this is a sacred site. And I tell you what, if you've been there, as you walk up to it, as you approach it, there is something in the air that is palpable. There is something almost so thick you can cut it. And I lived in that air for 15 and a half months, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Somebody asked me, would you do it again? I said, in a heartbeat. Of course, make me 20 years old again. I do it in a heartbeat. And I'd do it for 30 months if I had the chance. So, in 1958, unknowns from the Second World War in Korea were brought together aboard the USS Canberra off the Virginia coast. And this is the Korean unknown already selected by Master Sergeant Ned Lyle. They brought 4 from the National Cemetery of the Pacific, the Punch Bowl on Oahu. And that's where all the unknowns from Korea ended up, because they left nobody in the ground in Korea. They brought them out. And all the unknowns, almost 900 of them were in the Punch Bowl. They randomly selected 4, and one of the 4 was selected by Ned Lyle, and that's him right there. The European Theater had 13 candidates brought to Epinal Cemetery in France, and one of those 13 was selected, and 6 were brought to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, and one of those 6, 4 from the Philippines, 2 from the Punch Bowl, and one of those 2 is that person, and this is Corpsman William Charette. At the time, he was the only active duty Navy personnel, military enlisted personnel who had a Medal of Honor, so he was given the chore of selecting either this one or this one. This one will be buried at sea. These 2 come to the nation's capital, where they will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda for 48 hours. One of these is the Lincoln pedestal in the middle of the night, so each lay 24 hours on the Lincoln pedestal. And then, finally, to Arlington. Now, I asked a bunch of 8th graders who this was. You'd be surprised at the answer. Joe Biden. That's not Joe Biden. We all know who that is. And I will be at his museum and library on the 50th anniversary of his death on March 28th. He died in Walter Reed, March 28th, 1969. And they brought him to the Capitol from the National Cathedral to the Capitol on the 30th. And I was called out, my relief was called out to open car doors for dignitaries. And first door I get is the Shah of Iran. And he's about 5'5", and the next door I get is Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and he's about 4'10". And then I get George Romney, and he's about my size. And then I get Speaker of the House McCormick. But at the end of those ceremonies, everybody's kind of cleared out. They've gotten back in their cars, and I see a staff car with 2 red flags coming out from underneath the east steps of the Capitol building, and I salute that car because I'm a specialist. 4th class, and as soon as he gets close enough that I know that he cannot see my eyes, nor can his driver see my eyes, I take a very quick glance down. I don't move my head Take a very quick glance down, and I see a feeble hand return my salute. And I see 5 stars on the epaulette. Omar Bradley returned my salute at his buddy Ike's funeral, March 30th of 1969, a day I will not forget, ever. Now, this is President Nixon acting as next of kin to the Korean unknown. This is Ike acting as next of kin, appropriately, to the World War II unknown, and then they will be lowered. And that is the Pentagon, and that is the side that was hit by Flight 77 on September 9/11/2001. And that plane came in right over the tops of the trees. And I heard it was loud in the cemetery. This is President Reagan presiding over the interment of remains that were said to be unknown from the Vietnam conflict. They never really were. May 11th, 1972, First Lieutenant Michael Joseph Blassie was flying an A-37 Dragonfly over An Loc, Vietnam, and his wingman said he saw tracers come up and go through the plane, and he saw Blassie's plane roll over. No distress call, no parachute. And he saw Blassie's plane go in with a fireball. And 6 months later, they came to the site. They were looking for him. They found the site. They found wreckage consistent with an A-37. They found artifacts, rubber life raft. They found 4 ribs, part of a pelvis and a humerus bone. Collected them and took them out. Finally, and they found a wallet with a picture ID in it, Michael Joseph Blassie's, with money in it, and the wallet disappears, taken probably for the money. So there went the best proof of his identification. So they labeled those remains BTB, believed to be Michael Joseph Blassie. And they sat on a shelf in the pathologist's place, Johnny Span's pathology office in Hawaii. And in 1979, another pathologist came in and called those remains into question. And they reclassified him X-26. And X-26 is in this casket. Now, please note the spikes over here. I'll talk about those in just a minute. And they buried him on the 28th of May of 1984. And the family found out through the work of Vince Gonzalez of CBS News and a guy named Ted Sampley, who was an advocate for MIAs and POWs, that both Gonzalez and Sampley believed that that was Blassie without a doubt in that casket. And they convinced the family. And his sister came to our reunion and talked about the path that they took. But they did have the technology then to do mitochondrial DNA testing on those bones, and they tested them. And they found out, yes, it was indeed Michael Joseph Blassie, unknown soldier, May 28, 84, May 14, 98. And he is buried in the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery near St. Louis, Missouri. And there's Michael. And here's Patricia, his sister. And she came and she laid all this stuff out on a table for us to look at. And she knew she was preaching to the choir when she was talking to a bunch of tomb guards. And she told the story from her family's point of view and said the family had a meeting, and finally everybody said their piece, and then it came around and they said, well, Mom, what do you think? And she said, let's bring Michael home. And that's what they did, and appropriately so. The family took a lot of flack from veterans organizations that didn't want it to happen, from groups that did not want those remains coming out of there. But by gosh, they got their son and brother back in 1998. This is called The Saddest Acre in America. I was just in this section visiting 2 graves that I wanted to see. Friends. And here's a little evidence of the sadness of Section 60 and a little more. Her name is Mary McHugh, and her fiancé, James John Reagan, was killed in Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2007. Now, there are about 1,500 graves in this photograph. Now, I said Arlington has 400,000 buried, but there are spousal burials. So there's one grave, and we were talking about this earlier, one grave with the veteran's name on one side and the spouse, and they're buried in the same plot, one deeper, one shallower. So there are about 300,000 markers in Arlington. And if there are 1,500 graves in this photograph, I tell kids, you'd have to reproduce this 20 times that direction and 10 times deep. That would give you 300,000 graves, okay? Just imagine that. Just imagine that in your mind, that you can create this photograph 200 times, and that's 300,000 graves. Now, I was 20 years old when this photograph was taken. Why is this man smiling? Well, he's at Fort Bliss. It's 110 degrees outside, and he's in air conditioning getting his photograph taken. Like anybody who had some college, I'd had 2 years at the University of Iowa. And like anybody who had some college, I got sent to infantry school. They didn't send the smart guys to clerk school. They didn't send them to truck driver school. They sent them to infantry school so that they might think about OCS or NCO school, okay? The Army had a method in its madness. So I went to Fort Ord, California for infantry training. And there I am with my buddy. And second week I was there, they had a meeting. Anybody between the heights of 5'10" and 6'2" who wanted to volunteer for the Old Guard, please report to such and such a building. And I went to that building, and they showed films of the Tomb Guards and the U.S. Army drill team and the caissons. And so I filled out the card, and on the back they said, why do you want to be a Tomb Guard? Why would you want to be in the Old Guard? I said, well, I'd seen the Tomb Guards when I visited after the '64 Boy Scout Jamboree in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Anybody else there besides myself? Okay. So I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. If I wrote down if I had a chance to be in that unit, I'd jump at it. And so I filled out the card. When I got there, the first day I was there, the company commander calls me into his office and says, Tudor, how would you like to go to West Point? And I said, who, where? He said, West Point. I said, well, why would you want to send me to West Point, sir? He said, well, you have real high test scores on the Army intelligence test. Now, there's an oxymoron. And I said, can I sleep on it, sir? Of course, that's not the kind of thing you sleep much on. He said, come back here 0800 hours in the morning. So I came back 0800 hours the next day and reported, this is Private Tudor, reporting, sir. And he said, don't say anything. He said, we realized you're 3 months too old. So I didn't have to make up my mind, and I hadn't made it up yet. And I have no idea what would have come out of my mouth. But nothing had to come out of my mouth. So I volunteered my way to the tomb by way of the U.S. Army drill team. I started on the U.S. Army drill team platoon, was scheduled to march in Nixon's first inaugural parade, and then got bumped because some guy came off leave, but I still was starting to learn what the drill team guys learned, and then I started going down to the tomb on my own time and learning what the Tomb Guards do. And that is total control over their composure. And I didn't know if I could pull that off. I had no clue if I had what it took to be a Tomb Guard, but I was going to try. And so I went down, and I got to Fort Myer, and there were 900 guys in the battalion, but only 15 of these guys. And I volunteered 3 times and got to be one of these guys. And this is that same day. There's that badge on my right breast pocket. And so I am one proud American soldier on this day. on this 4th-month anniversary, the first day I get to wear that badge on my right breast pocket. On Halloween of 1969, I became commander of the 2nd Relief, and I became the guy who changed the guard. If you've seen the changing of the guard, you know what I'm talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? I am Sergeant Tudor of the United States Army, commander of the Relief, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Although we weren't mic'd up. It was all a cappella because we had sometimes 1,000 people at a changing of the guard. So I used my pipes. But this is my weapon, 45, and this was a posed picture taken in the morning, so I became this guy, and the guy who inspects the weapon. And I tell you what, when they're inspecting the weapon, doesn't that look pretty serious? Like the guy's going to be in big trouble if there's something wrong, right? You know what? This guy knows it's clean, and this guy knows it's clean. But there's a little bit of showmanship involved. So we do the show because we want the people to say that this weapon is being inspected. If there's anything wrong with it, this guy is in deep trouble, okay? And there was a zero tolerance for errors if you were at the tomb. And if you messed up while you were at the tomb, guess where you were? Not at the tomb anymore. They didn't send you to jail. They didn't send you to the brig, but you were doing something else, somewhere else. And it wasn't being one of these guys. Because being one of these guys was pretty special. And I will tell you, I was just with a bunch of them, 150 of them. And actually, I just on Saturday night shook the hand and hugged the first female to receive the Tomb Guard Identification Badge. Her name was Heather Lynn Johnson. She started walking the mat as a corporal in early 1995 and was awarded the badge in September of 1995. And she's the first badge holder, female badge holder. There have been 3 others since then, and one of the others was at our reunion. So I'm going to take you up to the top here, and we're going to look straight down. I'm just going to take a few more minutes because I want to tell you about what this was like. Walking the mat. 21 steps. Halt, face, stand for 21 seconds, and we walked in a glide so that the head did not bob up or down or go side to side. If you couldn't glide, you couldn't be a guard. There were guys who were great soldiers but couldn't figure out how to walk funny. Okay? But 21 steps. Why 21? Echoing the full military honors of the 21-gun salute. Halt, face, stand for 21 seconds. Also 21, indicating the full military honors of the 21-gun salute. Now, just as I was coming on to be a tomb guard, a young guy just getting out of the Army from California pulled me aside and said, "I got a trick." I said, "What's the trick?" "I got something you can do that'll count 21 the same way every time, and it's perfect." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's the Lord's Prayer with trespasses and trespassers." Say it in a normal cadence. It's words. It's not abstractions like numbers. It's words. And it has a cadence, and you can say it to yourself, and you'll be right on the money all the time. And I used it, and it served me well. For the 8.5 months that I walked the mat, I passed this point in the middle about 20,000 times. For every time I passed that point and got to the other end, I said the Lord's Prayer twice. So that's 40,000 times. And every time I got to the end, I clicked my heels 3 times. That's 60,000 heel clicks in 8.5 months. And every once in a while, when you click those heels, you know, those steel plates on the inside of your heels, so you could make that nice crack. Every once in a while, your ankle bones would meet. That's when you exercised control and did not show anything that was going on. Now, we walked in all weather. And everybody who's ever walked the mat at the tomb will tell you summer was the worst. If you've been in D.C. in the summer, 95 degrees, 95% humidity. and we were wearing wool. And everybody says the heat's the worst, but we walked in snow, sleet, rain, impossibly heavy rain, but we walked in all of it, and we loved it. And our attitude was, is it going to get nasty? Bring it on. Because I have a mission here. And my mission is to guard this place and prevent anybody from doing it, any physical harm or disrespecting it. Now, if somebody came up here and acted like a jerk, we would come to port arms with our M14, face them and say, "It is requested that visitors maintain a mature and reverent attitude in the vicinity of the tomb. Thank you." That usually shut them up. If somebody came over the chains, you would challenge them. "It is requested that visitors remain on the outside of the chains." If they didn't heed, you repeated. If they didn't heed, then you had a bayonet and a rifle butt. And I never got to chase anybody down. I never got to go after them. But we were as perfect as humanly possible. When we walked out of our quarters, we lived in the basement right under here. We had a pool table, we had a bathroom, we had a shower, we had a kitchen, we had a place, of course, we didn't have a steam press, we had an ironing board back in the day, but we got it done. And, you know, when you walked out of the door of that place to go up to your duty, you did not move your face one iota. You froze your face. And in our day, these chains went right around the end of the mat so people could stand within a few feet of you, almost close enough to touch, and they could see your every little movement. And tell you what, I froze my face. And I just dared my face to do something else. And I froze my face because I didn't want to let anybody see me screw up. Be less than perfect. Now, what could challenge you was the unexpected. People would come up and tell you jokes. What do you call a deer with no eyes? No idea. Okay. That was never going to make you laugh. But one day I had just got to this end of the mat. I just halted and faced, and I heard bzzz. And the largest bumblebee I'd seen in my entire life landed on the tip of my nose. I could feel his hind legs inside my nostrils. And he sat there for about 10 seconds and then flew off. And boy, was I glad when he flew away. And I did exactly what I was trained to do, which was absolutely nothing. I did not blink. I did not react to him. About 3 weeks after that, I was standing at the same end of the mat. Now, this is all closed off. Nobody can come up these steps anymore. But back in those days, a lady had come up and placed herself right in front of me. She was behind the chains, and she raised her little Instamatic. Remember those? And she raised her little Instamatic and went click. And she put her little Instamatic down, and then she walked away, and I almost lost it. I was the only one there who knew what she'd just done. I was also the only one there that knew that she had just taken an extremely close-up photograph of her very own eyeball. She had that camera bass-ackwards, as we used to say. I had visions of her getting her film back a week later. But I retained my composure, maintained my composure. And about a month later, shortly before I became commander of the relief, I'm down here waiting for the inspection to begin at parade rest, and I see something coming at me on the ground, and it's a little baby squirrel, and the little baby squirrel jumps up on the toe of my right shoe. And this is not bad. But then he climbed my leg. Inside my pants. There's a joke with a bad punchline, but I'm not going there. he left, and boy was I relieved, believe me, when he left. Every tomb guard has stories like that to tell you, but it happened to everybody. It was part of the job. It went with it. The last story I'm going to share before I wrap this up is a story of why we have this place. And I've heard this story in various permutations from the 50s, from the 60s, from the 70s, until they moved the crowds back when you couldn't get close to the Sentinel anymore. But in about 1965, one of our guys had just walked to here, turned and faced, and he heard approaching him from behind weeping and footsteps. And the footsteps stopped right behind him. And a female voice says, "My son disappeared in France in 1944. This is the only place I have. God bless you, son, and thank you." That is why we have this place. And that is why everyone who does this, who's ever done this job, feels it here, like that soldier felt it that day when he knew completely and fully why we have this place and why we protect it so carefully and why we do our darndest to be as perfect as humanly possible, because to strive for anything less is to dishonor the three individuals who gave not only their lives but their identities, who are in these three graves. This is the empty Vietnam crypt. It was rededicated in 1999. It now says "Honoring and Keeping Faith with America's Missing Servicemen, 1958 to 1975. So we walked in all weather. I call this we were bare-eared all winter in my day. I tell the young guys, they don't believe that. I call this old army, new army. Dumb army, smart army. Tough army, wuss army. They know I'm just having fun with them. But I would have worn flaps if I'd had them. But we didn't have the option back in 1969 and 70. So this is the whole crew. That is Sergeant First Class Joe Dees, Sergeant of the Guard. This is my crew. That's me in the center. We were all 6'2" and 3/4, plus or minus 1/8 of an inch. We were all 175 pounds, plus or minus 5 pounds, and we all had 30-inch waists. I wish I had it back, but it ain't going to happen. And I got to realize that. But I'm going to finish as I began, with what I call the Sentinels Creed. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, never will I falter. And with dignity and perseverance, my standard will remain perfection. Through the years of diligence and praise and the discomfort of the elements, I will walk my tour in humble reverence to the best of my ability. It is he who commands the respect I protect, his bravery that made us so proud. Surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night, this soldier will, in honor and glory, rest under my eternal vigilance. Thank you all for coming, and I will be glad to take any questions. If you do have a question, there is a mic next to the aisle in the back. Please go to the mic and ask me, and we'll try to keep this short because there are cookies and stuff waiting. And Simon, nobody knows who Simon was or Simon is. And I will say simply Simon, not simple Simon, but simply Simon. Well, some other day. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for your talk tonight. I found it quite interesting, and I enjoyed it a lot. The question that I have is concerning who gets to be buried there. I've read about some of the requirements, but I'm curious about the Kennedys, especially when you mentioned that President Taft is buried there, and
Yes.
he's kind of off in a a non-prominent spot, and then
Commander-in-Chief can be buried at Arlington. However, the reason that Bobby is buried in Arlington is because he also served in the Senate and had 1 day of active duty. He was actually in the Naval Reserves and active duty Navy from, I believe, 42 to 44. And Ted Kennedy is there because he served 2 years in the United States Army, 1951 to 53. And so he is also in the Senate, of course, but he is there because of his active duty service. So requests for burial from the Kennedy assassination in 63 to 67 doubled from 3,000, more than doubled from 3,000 to 7,000 per year. They cannot do 7,000 a year. They do 25 to 30 funerals per day, 6 to 8 on Saturdays, none on Sundays. So it is filling up, and there are going to be further restrictions. Right now, if you're retired, you qualify. If you have a Purple Heart, Silver Star, Distinguished Service Cross or equivalent, or Medal of Honor, you are automatic. Or if you died on active duty, you are automatic into Arlington. But they are reviewing those, and those will change in the next few years, and they will be more restricted than they currently are.
I have a ranger friend who said that the training that you people do is very secluded and very intense, and I wonder if that is still true, and if you'd give us a brief description of what that's all about.
There's a lot of stuff out there on the internet about how we can't talk for a certain period of time, and a lot of things like that, and some of it's true and some of it's not, and the training regimen has changed over the years since I went in and to current day. It is very, I will say, all I can say is it is very rigorous. I would not want to go to Ranger School either, but it is very rigorous and very, very demanding.
Thank you.
Your talk was wonderful. Thank you for all the detail you gave us and all the stories. I loved it. I'm a tribute Rosie at the Yankee Air Museum, and we've been working very hard with the Veterans History Project to gather the stories of the women who worked in the defense industries during World War II. Rosie the Riveters. I just videotaped one this weekend, and she was talking about her brother who was buried at Arlington at the USS Serpens Memorial.
Yes.
And this was an ammunition ship that blew up in Guadalcanal.
Yes, and it was a Coast Guard ship.
Yes, it's still the worst disaster they've ever had.
It was about 400, I believe, that were killed in the explosion of the Serpents.
Yes.
And there is a memorial in Arlington with, I believe, the names of all those who perished.
59, she showed me the picture of the 59 flag-draped coffins.
Yes.
And my question is, they have the memorial, they have all of their names on there, including her brother, but would they have buried these 59 coffins, or is that just symbolic for the pictures and the families?
That is those that they could. It's just those that they could. The USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor February 15th, 1898, killing 262 American sailors, and about 170 of them are buried in Arlington. They were buried in Cuba first and then brought back and reburied with about over 100 flag-draped coffins on the 28th of December of 1899. So those things happen, and there were some that, and many of the graves in the main section say unknown, so they were not identifiable, and then some, and in the Serpents, I'm sure eyes were blown to bits, nothing to retrieve. But in the USS Maine section, it says 4 unknowns in one casket, so in one grave.
Okay, and then one other question. There will never be any other unknown at the tomb for future wars? This is...
Everybody gives instead of fingerprints in my day, they give DNA now. So
Right.
if any part of anybody's retrieved, they can match it up and tell who it is.
Will they add one more crypt thing that says unknown? Because what if there's nothing left?
There will be no more unknowns.
Okay.
And as I said, that the Vietnam empty crypt has been rededicated, and it says honoring and keeping faith with America's missing servicemen 1958 to 1975.
Okay, thank you.
You said you were from Des Moines, Iowa.
Yes.
What high school did you attend? Number one, were you in ROTC when you were at Iowa? And are your parents affiliated with the service somehow?
I attended Theodore Roosevelt High School, and I was inducted into the Theodore Roosevelt High School Hall of Fame April 6th of this year, where I joined Bill Bryson and Cloris Leachman. And my dad was the head of the Boy Scout Council in Des Moines.
Okay.
Yes. One more. Go ahead, sir.
I want to ask kind of a different question. You described the experiences you had doing the 21 steps, and obviously very disciplined and following a routine, and then the Lord's Prayer. Did you know of anybody who ever had an experience somewhat beyond just the physical, being there in that setting, and where you described the air being very thick, and what I'm referring to is something?
To be out there at midnight with a full moon overhead was transcendent. And to understand that you were with these three individuals. The supernatural, I would say that I would not describe that as supernatural, but I would say just the knowledge of where you were and what you were doing, and that you were there by yourself with these individuals. That was hard to describe, and I can't put words to it right now.
It was quite a feeling, an emotional
Yes.
state. Thanks.
Okay, yes. Thank you all for coming out, and I'm sure the polls are closed. Let's see. Yes. Okay, one question here. I'm going to repeat. How long was each shift? And that's a great question, because in my day, we walked a full hour and we're off for 2 or 3. And then we'd come back and walk a full hour and then be off for 2 or 3. Now at night, we would go up for 2 hours and be off for 4 or 6. And those 2 hours that stretched between 1 and 3 a.m. In January, on a cold January night, was a pretty long stretch, but you did stuff to keep yourself going. But in 1971, they went to half-hour shifts through the tourist season from April 1st to October 1st, and that was the reason is that we were tougher. No, the reason is that they wanted more guard changes, so more people, because people come up to take a picture of the changing of the guard, they want to witness the changing of the guard, so they had more guard changes by doing twice an hour, top and bottom of the hour. And then that still persists today. They do April 1st to October 1st, half-hour walks, and then October 1st to April 1st, they go back to the 1 hour. So, and that 1 hour in August could be extremely long.
Ladies and gentlemen, you can see why we had Tom Tudor come back. Let's give him a great round of applause.
Thank you very much.
He'll take more of your questions in the lobby, so we
Yes.
encourage you to linger, and we look forward to seeing you at future programs. Again, if you want to sign up to receive email notices, there are forms outside the left door, and also lists of upcoming programs. And Tom, we have a little token for a repeat visit, other things related to Gerald R.
Wonderful.
And we thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. I'll find a place in my bag. I've been living out of a bag for a week.
Well, these are
So
little. These are little.
oh, okay. This will help me. This will help me remember how to pack. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you for coming. I appreciate you coming out on this wet and blustery night, but we'll we'll all go home and see what the political pundits have to say.